Welcome you to CEC EduSet Network. We are doing the series on ways of seeing society, in which we have invited eminent scholars of India. Today we have in the studio with us Professor Zoya Hasan. Professor Zoya Hasan teaches in Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has been teaching since last 35 years and has a huge experience of conducting research on Indian realities. We are going to request her to start with give a very broad idea of the perspective that she uses for understanding Indian politics and the method, techniques that she has used in her researches, and that within that perspective will then follow up the questions, issues that she has raised, and also we'll talk about the new issues emerging on which she thinks that the new generation of scholars should really work. I welcome Professor Hasan. I would like to switch over to her.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be speaking on this channel. Let me start by saying that emphasizing the importance of studying Indian politics. It's extremely important for us to examine, investigate, explain the Indian political phenomena. Indian politics today is going through a major transition. There have been major transformations in our society, in our economy, which have impacted on the polity, as indeed political processes have also influenced society and economy. We are in the midst of very major changes in the past 2 decades. In fact, the changes are so wide and far-reaching that so far, and they have thrown up very many major issues that are important for students of Indian politics, for researchers and scholars to take up. Indeed, at present, there is a great deal of interest in India everywhere. There are institutes of Indian studies, of Indian economy, politics, chairs being set up in different universities. So this is really the moment. This is the moment to come to grips with Indian social reality, with Indian society, and with Indian politics. How do we do it? I think the perspective a perspective for the study of Indian politics must be one which takes into account ideas, events, institutions, and processes. I think all these four ideas, thought, events, institutions, and processes are important. And if we connect these four sets of dimensions that I have mentioned, we have a perspective there. And I think the perspective is a state-society perspective. That's the best way to understand Indian politics. Any perspective which focuses only on political institutions or political structures without taking into account societal structures, economic structures, would give us an incomplete account. Therefore, it is important to understand the interconnections between state and society. And state, as we know, is itself consists of institutions, structures, institutions, which means, let's say, for example, if you're looking at the Indian state, there is an architecture of institutions on which the state stands. But it's not just the architecture of institutions. We know that there are deeper structures of society on which the state on which the state is based. So, for example, then equally important, and I think now more so than before, policies seem to matter in the study of state. So I would say that state-society relationship, where we do not give primacy to either of the two, but try and understand the interconnection between the two without giving primacy to either the state or society, or without conflating state and society, is the perspective that can help us to understand our social and political realities. I think the state-society perspective is particularly important for understanding our polity, because in our country, even after globalization, economic liberalization, economic reforms, and so on, the state matters. The state is very important. So therefore, no understanding of Indian politics can be complete without understanding, without taking into account the state. But equally, in a society which has such a long history, which has an ancient civilization, we are talking of a society which has been which has been there for millennia. Clearly, society is important, and by society I mean social structures, I mean culture. All of that is also important, and by society, when I say societal structures, I have in mind clearly several different axes of structure, starting with class, caste, community, gender. All of these structures, and indeed they are structures, they're important. They're important, important to understand. These are structures which have undergone a significant change. So, state-society perspective. Secondly, I would say in our post-globalization, a political economy perspective is extremely important, because the economy has become so important. It affects your life, my life, it is so very, very important. So a political economy perspective is extremely important, but we must be mindful that political economy for a student of politics, no matter what your own ideological perspective might be, should not end up as economic determinism or economic reductionism. Political economy perspective, we have to take a political economy perspective from the standpoint of understanding political process, institutions, public policies, political movements, political ideas, and so on. Thirdly, I think it's extremely important to keep our focus in understanding Indian society and polity on change, on transformation. This society has been in the midst of major changes, as I said at the outset. First, there was the transition from colonialism to decolonization to the post-independence period. That was a major moment of change, a moment of change, far-reaching in its obviously far-reaching in its impact. Then there have been several different moments of major change. I would say there were major changes in the early 1970s as far as society and polity were concerned. That was the beginning of by the mid-70s, we could already see that we were moving in the direction of a multipolar, multi-party system, although that came into existence much later. But we could see the imposition of the emergency, the opposition to the emergency, and the defeat of the Congress Party in the 1977 election was clearly an indication of the emergence of a post-Congress polity. So we can certainly, so that was a very, the 70s, of course, in terms of economic development, in terms of economy and society too, there were major changes that were at work. I would say a third and perhaps after independence, perhaps the most significant transformation happened in 1991 with the change in the paradigm of economic policy, when we moved from a state-dominated economy, perhaps a state-dominated economy with a focus on economic sovereignty, to a market-dominated economy where economic sovereignty did not have the same significance. Self-reliance was clearly a manifestation, or if you like, the most important dimension of the emphasis on economic sovereignty before 1991. Now, the opening of the economy and the integration and the gradual integration of the Indian economy into the world economy and opening the doors to globalization, to foreign investment, to foreign companies and so on, has certainly transformed the economy. We moved from a Hindu rate of growth, which was roughly 2 to 3%, to now 7 to 8% sustained growth. And we have focused a great deal of attention on growth, on high growth. Now, for a student of politics, to give you an example of how important it is to have a political economy perspective, but one which is not economistic or economically deterministic, I think it's extremely important for us to see not just the issue of growth, but the implications of growth, who is benefiting from growth. And as a student of politics, politics is about the people. That's what politics is about. And politics in a democratic state is fundamentally about the people, and if that is our focus, then we can't possibly, even as we take a political economy perspective, only focus on growth. We have to see what is the meaning of this growth, who is benefiting from this growth, who's benefiting from this growth, and is everyone included in this growth, because the market is notorious for being exclusivist rather than inclusivist, as neoliberals or those who support a market economy would claim. So the equity dimension is very, very important. So the way I understand a political economy, a state society perspective combined with a political economy perspective, I would say that growth, I think, is an extremely interesting issue for us to investigate and examine from this perspective. And once we combine a state society come political economy perspective, we will see that it's not enough to focus on GDP. It's not enough to focus on rates of growth, but per capita income. And when we look at per capita income, we can see that there's such a big gap between high growth rate, which is something like 8 to 9%, and as we know, India is one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and is probably the third or fourth largest economy in the world in terms of its GDP. But when we look at per capita income, the picture is vastly different, because the benefits of this high rate of growth have been hugely concentrated in a certain percentage. That is to say, the upper crust of society. At best, you could say 15 to 20% people have benefited from growth. So it's, as I said, I mean, as a student of politics, we can't focus only on growth. Even as we take a political economy perspective, we have to bring in the people's dimension. So the third point that I think I'm trying to make is that politics is surely about ideas, institutions, processes, events, but ultimately all of this is linked to people. And there is nothing like the people. People are in turn part or members of classes, castes, communities. There is a gender division. So therefore we can't treat the people or people, or for that matter even the nation is an important category, as one. So I think overall then what I would suggest is that it's very, very important for us to focus on transformations, focus on change, because this is a society in change. My fourth point would be that while I started by saying that it's extremely important for us to study Indian politics, to understand the complexities of Indian politics, because Indian society is so complex, so diverse, so differentiated, so varied, that it's very, very important to understand Indian politics and society in all its complexity. But at the same time, our focus cannot be just on understanding India. We have to look at India in a comparative perspective, especially because we are living in we are living in global times. We are living in times when the world is interconnected by ideas, by finance, by economy, by travel, by the internet, by the new media. There are just so many ways in which the world is connected, and events in one part of the world and policies in one part of the world affect others. For example, the recession, the world recession over the past 2 years or so, really originated in the United States, and their very short-sighted policies in the United States, but it has affected the world economy. It affected India. India was perhaps able to withstand some of it because thanks to some sensible policies followed by the government of India, which is to say the government did not go in for mindless liberalization and privatization and so on, and the public sector was not sold off or privatized completely. It remained a buffer and a bulwark against the excesses and the greed of the market and those who benefit from the market. But so we were able to withstand it. But the fact is that we were affected by it, which is to say that what happens in the United States, or what was done by European banks and so on, or American banks and their lending policies and their credit policies and their housing loans and so on and so forth, affected most countries. So it's in this spirit and context I'm suggesting that a comparative perspective where we just don't become Indianists and we look at India only from the important as it is to understand India and its complexities, we should not fall prey to the idea which had dominated Indian studies and continues to exercise an influence, which is Indian exceptionalism, that we are an exception. We are different from Europe, but we are also different from the developing world. So India is an exception. Now, of course, what lends weight to the idea of Indian exceptionalism is the sheer size of the country, which is so huge. We are talking of the second largest country in the world, and also its physical size is very large. 3, it's a very complex country. There is a great deal of diversity and variety, and also it's an ancient country. So altogether, India is a world in itself. And indeed, we are the world, because as the second largest country, if we think of China and India together, we are talking of almost more than half the world. But that said, as far as perspectives are concerned, I think we cannot close ourselves to international ideas, to international thinking, and to comparisons. For example, there are 2 kinds of comparisons we can do. One is comparing politics, processes, policies within the country across states. That's because we are so large and because we have so many different states, and now that we have a federalized polity, we also even have different political parties governing different states with different sets of policies. After all, how many countries would have governments, as many governments as we have, as many states as we have, which are governed by so many different political parties with different different ideologies and policies ranging from the left to the right, to the center, to regional parties, and so on and so forth. So that's one kind of comparison that we can do, because we are fortunate to be so large and with having so much variety in a federal system. The second kind of comparison that we can do is, let's say, at least attempt to look at India in relation to developments and trajectories in our neighborhood, South Asian countries. We know so little about South Asian countries, be that Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and so on. Even though our policies are, even though our foreign policy seems to be so direct, so focused on South Asia, particularly Pakistan, but we have very little knowledge about Pakistani society, economy, polity, history, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. So I think we would do very well to look at India in comparison to the trajectories of development in our neighborhood. And of course, then there is a comparative perspective which would include a comparison of India with other post-colonial societies. But significantly in India, when we do think of other countries, we invariably think of the West. In terms of ideas, it would be rare to look at ideas, political ideas that may exist or have emerged in other countries. So therefore, in the realm of political thought, we do either Indian political thought or we do Western political thought. So I think the comparative perspective is very, very, very important. And together, these four dimensions, I think, provide us with a framework for understanding Indian politics.
Great, thank you very much. I think there are, in fact, you have even 5 dimensions, if I can remind you. One is state society, another is political economy, third is transformation, fourth is inclusive growth, and fifth is comparative politics. Is
well, inclusive growth is included in the idea of political economy.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
I would say 4.
4 issues that you have actually mapped the way you have seen Indian politics. What do you think in last 35 years, with this kind of perspective, what are the issues that caught your imagination and you kept yourself busy with those issues?
I mean, my own interests have focused on the study of political process. I have not focused as much attention as I should have focused on the study of institutions. I think that's an area that I have neglected. And indeed, when we look at the study of Indian politics over the past 30, 35 years, and I'm going beyond my own interests, there's much greater focus on a political process than on institutions. Whereas if you look at the study of Indian politics in the first 2 decades after independence, the focus was on constitutionalism, on institutions. And then from the 1970s, with political change and with very rapid political change, clearly there was much greater attention given to process, because it was clear that just focusing on the constitutional edifice or the institutional structures is not enough. But I think what has happened as we look back at the last 30 years of the study of Indian politics, I think the pendulum now has gone to the other extreme, where the focus essentially on processes and not enough on institutions, and we need to strike a balance between the study of process and institutions, and include in this ideas and events, because we look at either institutions or we look at processes, but there have been such major events that have happened in India, and we need to look at some of these very, very important events, and and just do a kind of a sociology, morphology of events. And around events, there is so much that you can understand about politics. So I would say, yes, I've focused on processes, but besides political process, of course, my own interests have been in the area of understanding social and political movements, political parties, and the state. These are the areas that I have been interested in. And besides this, of course, I think a major new area of study in the study of Indian politics over the past 10 years, of course, are areas such as the relationship, such as gender, such as caste, such as community or minority communities. These have been important areas that I have also been interested in. So altogether, my central concern, if there's one central concern that informs my work and my interest, not just my work but my interest in life, so to speak, is really the question of equality. That is my central concern, is to understand inequalities and ways in which inequalities can be reduced. So trying to understand processes, structures, policies that are responsible for inequality, and then likewise the politics and policies that will promote equality. So in a sense, as I said, my entire work is an attempt to understand inequalities in Indian society in order to in order to increase equality. So it's the relationship between inequality and equality that informs really. That's my overarching concern. And for that reason, I have focused on political movements. I have focused on understanding the state. I do think that, for example, today it's extremely important, once again, to focus attention on the state, which we were concerned with in the past. But today we don't seem to pay as much attention in India to the question of state, in part because it's complex, but in part also because of this understanding that with globalization and economic liberalization, there's a retreat and reduction in the remit of the state. Now, indeed, there is a reduction in the remit of the state, but there is no reduction in the importance of the state. I think the state is as important as it was before economic liberalization. In some ways, I would say it is even more important. What has happened is that the nature of the state has changed. The nature of its activity has changed. The nature of its composition, so to speak, has changed. Today, you can clearly see that there is a nexus between politics and business. There is a nexus between politics and the corporate sector. In political science, and especially in the field of electoral politics, party politics, and so on and so forth, there is some concern and examination of the question of money and the role of money in elections. But I think the issue is much deeper than the fact that today 1/3 of MPs are millionaires, and that elections have become so expensive, that there's so much corruption, all of which is important. But I think at the heart of all this is really the politics-business nexus. Big business, it's for nothing that India is that India has probably the fastest rate of growth of billionaires. Now, there's a story there that, as a student of politics, we must try to understand. Why is it that we have the second or third richest persons? Why is it that so many people on the Forbes list of the richest people are from India, a country which is so poor? So what we must not, as a student of politics, ever forget, and ever always keep in focus, that Indian society is predominantly a poor society and country. 50% people, officially 50% people, if we go by the Tendulkar committee report, if not 50, 46, 47% people are poor in this country. In a country which has 8 to 9% GDP, which, as I said, where the number of billionaires, the rate of growth of billionaires is what it is, where you have a Mukesh Ambani who's about to move into a 27-floor house, which according to I think Forbes magazine, will be the most expensive house in the world, the most expensive house in the world. Now, this is something for us to think about. Surely, something like this, even after economic reform and so on, is unlikely in many European countries. So I think whereas if you look at the study of Indian politics today, it has changed hugely from the study of politics in the 50s and 60s, then 70s and 80s, and now. Now, for example, earlier on, we would say that caste is not an issue of concern for political science. That's a sociology area. Now, that's not the case anymore, because there's so much work being done on caste and questions related to caste-based discrimination, humiliation, caste movements, caste empowerment, and so on and so forth. So all of that is happening. But I think what I think is one of the striking absences in the study of Indian politics is that we still do not give sufficient importance to the questions of poverty. Because a country where 50% people are so poor, and if we go by the Arjun Sen Gupta Committee report on the unorganized sector, 77% people live on 22 rupees a day. Even if we say that maybe this underestimates the amount of money people have, but how much can it underestimate? If it's not 22, maybe people are living on 25, 27 rupees a day. And look at the rates of inflation, food inflation, because inflation in India is essentially food inflation. Now, how many of us in the profession of political science have bothered to really closely look at this Arjun Sen Gupta Committee report and what it means? What does it tell us about India's social structure, about India's economic structure, about society? I think this is very, very important. Secondly, I'll give you another example from the other side. You look at the 11th plan. Is it the 11th? Yeah, well, we are moving now towards the 12th plan. For the economic survey, sorry, not the plan. The economic survey for 2010-11 included for the first time a chapter titled "The Enabling State." For students of politics, whether you're interested in the question of state in the way in which I think it is important, whether you think so, whether you share that perspective or not, the fact is that for the first time you have a government document which has provided the economic philosophy of the government, the United Progressive Alliance government. No government has actually put forward a concept such as this one, which is very important. Now, the enabling state is an idea that needs to be examined, its relevance. Now, of course, the idea is that an enabling state is something which is appropriate after economic reforms, where the state alone is not important. The market is also important. The state is supposed to do only so much. The rest of it will be done by the economy. So the idea is that you have an enabling state which will focus its attention really on what is essential and what it can do well, and supporting those who are really who are at the bottom, sort of the bottom 20%. You focus so you focus on human development, social development, and so on. Now, as I said, for students of politics, these two ideas that I've just suggested, both the unorganized sector report and the idea of the enabling state. Now, how many courses, if I may say so, how many political science courses would courses or students, researchers, scholars are concerned with these critical issues? But this is what, now we would be concerned with these issues if we were not just focused on the social and political dimension, social dimension of politics, and of course politics itself. But if we were to look at it in a more composite way, where we look at economy, society, and polity, and look at the interconnections between economy, society, and polity. Two, we take into account the transformations. Then only, I think number three, we keep at the center of attention the question of poverty and deprivation and marginalization. When we take because I think basically it is our responsibility as social scientists to focus on questions of poverty, deprivation, marginalization, disadvantage. They constitute, people who suffer from all of this constitute the majority in our country. But I'm afraid in political science, when we do examine these issues, we look at it only from a policy standpoint. So we look at anti-poverty programs and how they're being implemented. I don't think the purpose of political science is only to look at the implementation of a program, but we have to really investigate and examine the politics of these policies.
Yeah, I think your major concern seems to be equality, and within equality, inequality, marginality, whatever you call it. And within that, you want to explore the nature of a state, the inter-community relationship, or the minorities' problems.
No, my concern is not really with minorities or with the ethnic issue. My concern is with the issue of inequality and equality. Now, it won't be at all correct to say that if I'm concerned with the issues that I have outlined, I think I've probably mentioned the word minority once in the last half an hour.
Okay.
So that certainly can't be my concern at all. I mean, it is my concern, but it is one of, it's part of it. Yeah.
Do you think that this kind of framework that you have presented,
which is not a framework for understanding minorities at all, it's a framework for understanding
the Indian politics and Indian society, but do you think that this framework really misses out something which is very crucial in Indian society? For instance, the whole issue of religion and its role in politics, the way now in last 15 years you find that the agenda of politics was really defined by the issues of religion, and probably with new judgment from on Ayodhya from High Court will for next 10 years again bring this issue on the forefront. So the issue of the institutions grappling with religion, issue of political parties changing its strategy to handle the religious question. The social scientists are probably now giving up the idea of secularized synthesis. So what do you think, how is your framework going to grapple with this issue, or you think that it is not an important issue for you at all?
Well, religion is certainly important, and it is clearly important in Indian society, because Indian society, all said and done, is a deeply religious society. So we cannot possibly understand in fullness Indian society and polity and its interconnections without taking into account religion as well. A state society perspective is significant and useful precisely because it looks at the interconnections between society and polity, between society and state, and society includes religion. So now I would not privilege religion over other issues, but it is included in society, and I think the state-society perspective certainly helps us to understand society. But secondly, I think religion is certainly important and was quite important in the 1990s, and it certainly impacted the polity. Religion that became so important in the 1990s, however, was not just religion. It was politicized religion. It was political religion. It was the politics of religion. It was religion was used. It was exploited. It was harnessed to political ends. We would be making a mistake to think that the Ayodhya movement was all about religion and the importance of that site for the Hindu community. Of course, for large numbers of people, indeed, it is of great religious significance. But for those who organized a movement, an agitation, a campaign, surely this was not, even though it may have been led by religious people and so on. It was a political movement. It was a quintessentially political movement. It was a movement which was aimed. It was a movement which sought to unify Hindus. It sought to mobilize Hindus as a community. There was a majoritarian sentiment giving primacy to the majority community. The idea was to mobilize Hindus who otherwise are obviously, like all other communities, are divided along caste lines, but perhaps there is no other religion which in many ways is as internally divided as the Hindu religion. So the idea was to mobilize Hindus in order to build support for political Hinduism, which itself would become the basis for building support in order to expand the political influence of the Sangh Parivar, which included the BJP, which is, as it were, the political arm of the Sangh Parivar. The idea behind this movement was clearly BJP and the Sangh Parivar felt that they had finally found a formula through which they will be able to replace the Congress in North India and possibly in the country. And briefly, they succeeded in doing that on the basis of this mobilization of sentiment and hurt and humiliation and all of those ideas that were pressed into service. But of course, none of this would have worked if at that particular moment there wasn't. It was a society which was just beginning to change in a very major way. Now, of course, it's more settled, let's say 20 years later. But there was a great deal of anxiety about national identity. There was a great deal of anxiety among the middle classes about changes that were beginning to take shape. There was a great deal of anxiety about India's place in the world. So there were a large number of issues which helped the BJP in catapulting what appeared to be an issue of sentiment to the political stage. But let's make no mistake, as Mr. Advani himself said when he was leading the Rath Yatra, he said very, very explicitly that I am leading this movement not as a religious movement, it is a political movement. And in fact, he used the phrase, make no mistake about it. Make no mistake, this is political. So it was directed, as I said, in part against the state. It was directed, of course, at replacing the Congress. It was, of course, an argument against secularism, and it was an attempt to turn a religious majority into a political majority. That was the central, that is what majoritarianism is all about. When you try to build a permanent majority on the basis of a religious demographic majority. And we know that democracy is based on majority rule, but not majoritarianism. Whereas I think the Sangh Parivar was quite consciously conflating majority rule and majoritarianism. So religion is important, but religion is important because of the politics of religion rather than religion per se. And I think we must. To respond to your question, I would say certainly religion has had an impact, but at the same time, I think we must also take note of the fact that that moment in Indian politics was when religion came to the center stage, was a particular moment. There was a particular context in which this happened, and you can see that the importance of religion has receded. In the same way, because so much has happened since Ayodhya, since the Ayodhya movement of the early 1990s. So much has happened in the past 20 years that to some extent, to a large extent, we can argue that perhaps religious politics will take a back seat, because what people are interested in now are opportunities, livelihood, education. Those are the main. Livelihood is the main concern of the vast majority of people, and for those and for others who are in the middle classes and so on, clearly a better life is what everybody seems to be working for.
But let me try to explore it further. In last few decades, it seems, or last one decade definitely, what we see is there is a great rise in the interest of people in religion per se. The evidence of this is the ongoing new religious movements. The old religious movements have been revived, new religions have emerged, and if you look at the television channel, all religions have their dedicated channels now, and there is round the clock program going on. So do you think that people are becoming more religious in this decade? It seems that there is an axial age coming back when religion is returning to our society in a big way. What Derrida calls it return of religion. Some people call it revenge of religion against modernity. So do you think, apart from this fundamentalist politics or whatever is going on, there is a larger resurgence of religion, globally speaking?
Yes, I think there is. There is a larger resurgence, expansion of religion in the public domain. I mean, it's not, religion didn't go anywhere. It's not as though religion had completely vanished and religion was defeated by secularism. But I think secularism and modernity, which were going hand in hand, to some extent you could say that that after globalization and economic liberalization and the kinds of huge changes that globalization is bringing into the social world of people, into social life, that large numbers of people find that religion can provide an anchor, anchored for and stability, so to speak, in a world which is changing so rapidly, which is changing so fast. So that's one aspect. I think identity politics itself was in part a reaction to globalization, but I wouldn't say identity politics was entirely a reaction. I think identity politics and globalization seem to go hand in hand. So it's not as though one that is identity politics and religious politics is a reaction to globalization, but I think it is these two things have happened simultaneously.
There's no causal relationship.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. It's not you're very right. It's not a causal relationship, one causing the other, but in a very interesting and paradoxical way, they seem to go hand in hand. So to understand religion, perhaps, and as you put it, its resurgence, maybe we need to understand the nature of globalization and why this might be why the connection between globalization and religiosity and but I think the issue is there are two issues. Yes, there is more religion or more evidence of religion in the public domain than, let us say, a couple of decades earlier. But I think all societies are not necessarily witnessing a growth in religiosity. Indian society, indeed, and the middle classes in particular, clearly going by the evidence that you were giving of these various religious channels and so on, Indian society surely, and the middle classes, there seems to be an increase in religiosity. In Europe, there is no indication, at least in Western Europe and so on, of an increase in religiosity. And I think thirdly, it's very important to remember that when we are talking of religion in the public domain, it is usually political religion, which is in the public domain. It is political Islam, it is political Hinduism, but obviously political Islam more than anything else is very much in the public domain in different parts of the Muslim world. Most definitely, there's politicized Islam. And for Muslims, of course, it has to be said. In part, in their case, in part, it is a reaction to globalization, and it is in part a reaction to American invasions, to American, the way in which the United States and its foreign policy has sought to subjugate many Muslim countries. So in India, I think in part Islamization and the growth of Islamic identity, I think, is in part, of course, a reaction to the growth of political Hinduism and the way in which it impacted on minorities, especially starting with the demolition of the Babri Masjid.
Okay, so I think that the perspective that you have used does have space to accommodate this new kind of resurgence of religion, and one can actually enter from state society perspective to work on religion instead of working from orthodox sociological point of view.
Absolutely correct. You put it very well. I think the point is to look at religion from a state society perspective rather than from looking at it, in my way of thinking, from the standpoint of religion, religious traditions, and religious ideas. Of course, they are important. They're certainly important. But I think if we want to understand the significance of public religion, then I think it is incumbent on us to go beyond religious traditions and religious ideas. Then we have to look at public religion, which means political religion. We have to also look at then the relation, for example, fundamentalism. Now, Islamic fundamentalism is a political ideology. It's a political idea. It's not just about religion per se, but it is a fundamentally political movement. Secondly, I think it's also important to look at the relationship between religion and economic and social development. In what way, directly or indirectly, does religion impact policy making? For example, if you look at the whole issue of the development deficit, that according to the Sachar Committee report on the socio-economic status of Muslims, the development deficit is very difficult to understand without taking into account the indirect influence of religion on policy making, which is to say that the neglect of the economic and social development of Muslims by successive governments over the past 60 years cannot be understood unless we take into account prejudice, discrimination on the basis of religion. So it's very so the issue of religion is important, but I think again in case of religion we have to take into account, as I said, a state society perspective which will help us to come to grips with the ways in which religion seems to religion affects politics, it affects policy as well.
Thank you very much. Can you just briefly, we have another minute and a half, tell the next generation of scholars what are the issues that you think you have missed out on and they should pick up in future? You have mentioned several of them actually, but what are the core 3-4 issues you think the next generation of scholars would actually work on?
Well, one area which has been neglected in the study of Indian politics is urban politics. I think urban politics, urban economy, urban politics is an extremely important area. Today, India's urban population is about 28%. Now, and look at the work we are doing on Indian politics. It is it's largely it virtually ignores urban politics. So I think the urban politics is certainly an important area. Second important area, which I think I've already mentioned, which we two areas I think that are urban politics. In addition to that, I think we need to renew and bring the state back in. 3, I would say the study of institutions, not just new institutions, but even existing and old institutions need to be examined. So I would say 3. I would say state, bring back the state. Second, institutions, and third, urban politics, and fourth, we must focus on the question of poverty and deprivation.
Thank you very much, Professor Zoya Hasan. I think it was a great pleasure to be with you in the studio, and I'm sure our listeners must have enjoyed it, and we'll be back with you after some time again to take up some of the issues to see how have you really worked on them. Thank you very much.